This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Mr. Oransky, I'd like to begin my questions with you. As we heard in your opening statement, Retraction Watch reports on scientific misconduct and retractions by many of its corporations. I've many questions regarding much of the things that you've said. But one thing I wanted to draw attention to the committee was something that you had on your website. A psychiatrist in Canada, this is an article on your website titled, "A Psychiatrist in Canada Faked Brain Imaging Data in Grant Application," says U.S. Federal Watchdog. I read in Retraction Watch that Romina Mirazi received grants from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research for nearly 3 million Canadian dollars and worked on this in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University, where it appears that none of her papers have been retracted yet. So my question is, by rewarding the pursuit of publishing, how are taxpayer dollars? How are we getting taxpayer dollars valued in this?
Thank you for the question. I want to sort of make a pitch in response, if I may, that perhaps as it is considering, as this committee and of course the government is considering how to look at research, how to examine it, how to assess it, it might also consider some contributions, some funding that is specifically delineated for looking at problems in the literature. In other words, sleuthing behavior, which is mostly done right now by volunteers, even though publishers and universities benefit from their work. If you look, for example, at the case of the Office of Research Integrity, which is responsible in the U.S. for oversight of research at the National Institutes of Health and some other agencies, but that's a $48 billion budget, roughly, that's U.S. dollars. Its budget is about $15 million, and I would have you all maybe consider whether or not there is a way to use some of the funding that is now being used to fund research directly to fund analysis of that research and to actually keep a check on it, so that I believe the public will be much more confident in what it reads about, what it's funding with its tax dollars, and what eventually, in many cases, and certainly in the case that you mentioned, could contribute, if it's done properly, to better health and better outcomes.
One of the concerns that we've been hearing from academia is just around the declining trust in their institution. How would we ensure that if folks are getting research dollars, that it's being used appropriately, and that we can ensure when I go back to my constituents and say, hey, these research dollars that are being spent well? Is there tweaks to we keep hearing about this peer review process. Is there things that we need to do maybe differently than the peer review?
I think in general, one method and one approach that a number of organizations are taking, and it's still a work in progress, is to have everything be much more open. That could mean publishing data openly, making sure that anyone who wanted to check those figures or take a look at the images or whatever it was had an opportunity to do that. That could be other researchers. It could be the general public. If you publish your data openly, it's at least a statement that you are going to stand behind it. In fact, again, more people can look at it. I think in terms of the peer review system, that is obviously a larger conversation that I'd be happy to have another time. But the idea that is a number of people have floated is we need to simply push far less through the peer review system, and we need to acknowledge its limitations. I actually still believe peer review is very powerful and important, but I also think that the public and many people even in science have been sold a bill of goods about how much peer review can actually catch and how good a system it is. It's being sold sort of as a good housekeeping seal of approval when in fact it is incredibly porous. And I think if we're honest about that, trust will follow.
Okay. You said you'd like to talk about peer review more broadly. Can you point us in the direction that you're thinking there?
There's a meeting actually every 4 years, sort of like the Olympics. It's held in Chicago that I heartily recommend. It's the Peer Review Congress. And people are actually looking in an empirical way, in other words, an evidence-based way, at where peer review could improve and how there are various ways to do that. The fact, though, is that at the moment, peer review is jamming, publishers are jamming millions of papers, as you all heard earlier today, through a system that simply is overstressed. And you can't really expect efficient quality control until you acknowledge that the system just doesn't have the resources.
Okay. Is there a second? I think you mentioned this earlier, and I just want to get you corrected on this. Is there kind of, in addition to peer review, is there a mechanism that we can use when assessing these projects to fund?
I think there is, and it actually is sort of, in some ways, consistent with peer review. I suppose that may seem contradictory, but hear me out for a moment. I think that instead of looking at citation counts, which are sort of born of the publish-or-perish incentives and the very pernicious incentives, perhaps rather than turning everything into a metric, we should look at the quality of the research and look at a handful of papers that a particular individual is publishing, maybe a larger number for a research project. We heard earlier from one of my colleagues on the panel that there are people who are excluded from that because they are excluded from grant applications.
I'm sorry, that's our time. Since the pandemic, maybe even before that, but we've certainly seen it since. Or I'm asking you, have you seen a rise in distrust of researchers and research generally? And what would you say the role of a parliamentarian should be in that? And again, I'm talking and I'm asking questions relevant to your expertise and experience in health and your role in that.
Okay, I heard a few questions in there, so I'll start in and hopefully get to some points that are important to you. First of all, I really welcome the fact that we have a Parliamentary Health Research Caucus that is nonpartisan. It has leaders coming from all parties, gives us an opportunity to bring the latest health research and innovation topics to Parliament and policymakers. And in fact, we consult to hear what some of the themes that are most important on the minds of people who have constituents that they're representing. I think it's safe to say that health is on all of our minds all the time, whether it's our own, our loved ones, our colleagues, or people we represent. And, it's a great privilege to be able to bring the latest. And I think that the pandemic actually, in many ways, increased Canadians' focus on the importance of health research. We had a very incredible response with mission-driven and rapid response research. The government worked across departments with companies, huge multinational pharmaceutical companies, innovation and research hubs at universities all across the country, and every part of this country were involved in that response. And, we've come out with lessons learned that will make us even stronger the next time.
Let's make another journal famous here. We have the International Journal of Hydrogen Energy, and a paper that was published in there. In the paper itself, it states, as strongly requested by the reviewers, here we cite some references. 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47. 13 sightings. And this is what's in the paper. It continues, although they are completely irrelevant to the present work, end quote. That was the researcher that was getting pressured by the reviewer to add those citations that had nothing at all to do with the paper itself. How often does something like this happen?
Thank you for the question. Something that blatant, in other words, where we actually see the evidence for it, is still fairly rare. What is much more common, and probably far more common than anyone would like to admit, is pressure on authors, pressure even from editors sometimes. There are journals that they want to increase their impact factor, something we just heard about, of course. And so what they do is they say, well, they don't quite come out and say this, but they say, there are review recommendations, go back, letters to the authors, and it says, well, we would really appreciate it if, or it would be better if you cited, a paper from our journal or something like that. And then it gets even more complex, a little bit harder to track, where they have these, and I use this phrase in my testimony, citation cartels, where people actually organize rings. There's a citation rings. And all of this, again, we don't know exactly how often it happens, but if you were to speak to a bunch of researchers, I doubt that any of them would, if they were being honest, and I would like to think they would be, would say that they've never had an experience where someone in some way has pressured them to cite their work, whether it's a reviewer, an editor, or even someone else. And so I think we need to, and this again is a natural outgrowth, if you will, a completely predictable response. People just respond to incentives, to knowing that you need your H index to be higher. And what's a good way to do that is to make sure that you are cited more often.
Switching gears a little bit, first off, thank you for the work that you do, the public service you do for not just for Americans, but an international audience, and to ensure that we have the best possible science out there. One of the things you shared was a little bit troubling, is that how few were catching up in Canada. Now, is this a good sign that research is healthy in Canada, or is it perhaps we're just not going through as much scrutiny as what is taking place in other countries?
I'll say something that perhaps would have been controversial some years ago, which is that there should be more retractions from Canada. And I don't mean any disrespect to your great nation. There should be more retractions from the United States of America. I could go on. The fact is that it's good news that we're finding them, and there are fields and, in fact, journals sometimes. And in the case that we heard earlier in the previous panel about Jonathan Pruitt was actually a case where it's pretty bad news that this, and I do believe the number of retractions, I could double check our database again, but it's bad news that that story happened. It's bad news that the misconduct happened. But what's worse news is how long it took to actually adjudicate. And so that's one sort of lesson from that story. The other, though, and here's some good news, is that the group of researchers from around the world that got together and actually said, we don't want people who Jonathan Pruitt to have any more collateral damage than they already might. And that led to a lot of retractions, but also protection for those researchers who really were victims of Jonathan Pruitt. And so I think all these stories are complex. And so I frequently am asked, what about this field? What about that field? What about this country? And I say, if there are fewer retractions, it's because people aren't looking. I trust when I actually see more retractions, and maybe that's easy for me to say given my work, but I actually think that's an important way to think about it.
Follow-up question on, if you had a said government that would like to promote a false narrative, how much money do you think it would need to be poured into research to make, depending on the claim, seem real? How expensive would it be for identity to fund research with the purpose of miscommunicating or miseducating the public?
It's a good question, and I'm going to answer, hopefully, with respect hypothetically, obviously. But I think that it's actually trivial if you wanted to, for example, fund a large body of research. I'm not even sure you would need the funding. You could actually sort of do other things to make sure that that work was published and then cited, and then eventually ending up in policy documents and in guidelines and et cetera, and maybe even in regulations. So I think it's just not that hard to get and I'm not talking about any particular area here or field, but it is not that hard to move a field in a particular direction based on basically pushing on those publishing levers.
Our time. Thank you very much.